So before I start, I wanted to have a shout out for my coders. I'm originally from UC Santa Barbara, but I did this work last year during the summer while I was an intern at Georgia Tech. So it's a big kudos to my coders, Cheng Zhang, Simon, and Wen Kili, without whom this work would have never seen the light. And the other thing is that I already presented this work in the past, and you may have heard about this work, but today I'm going to have a couple of new findings. For example, the title says from 2 permissions we can do bad stuff, but maybe in some cases we actually don't need them. We don't need them both. And that's just a little teaser. All right, so one slide about who I am. I'm a PhD student at UC Santa Barbara. I hope it's going to be like for my last week in my life. I'm graduating next week, crossing fingers. And I play with Shellfish, hacking team, and if everything goes fine, in September I'm going to join Hero Coming Friends as an assistant professor. And for my PhD, I mostly focus on mobile security. I did a bunch of program analysis. I was involved with Rohammer on Android called Dremmer with some folks from Vue. We even got a Pony Award yesterday for that. I was also involved with some studying cross-device tracking with ultrasound, and now my recent work is mostly on UI attacks. And I do procrastinate a lot, but when I don't, I'm on Twitter trying to push human knowledge boundary, as I know that you're very familiar. And I'm on Twitter at Rohammer, so if you're interested in this stuff, you may want to follow me. All right, so this work is about 3 things. The main one is a bunch of tricks to play with the UI, to do UI attacks. Some of these tricks are new. Some of these tricks are actually old. And what we do with the old ones is to show that defenses that were in place to defense from these old tricks and known tricks are actually not that useful in terms that they can be bypassed. And even worse, they can actually be abused to mount even worse attacks that wouldn't be possible without these defenses. And what we show is that these few tricks are enough to completely compromise the UI feedback loop, whatever that means, I'm going to tell you in a second. And this means that you can say bye-bye to your device security. What do I mean with UI feedback loop? Well, it's actually pretty simple. You have the UI, it shows something to the user. And in mobile phones, the UI is also the main way the user can interact with the phone. So there is also an input channel. And so, for example, you can tap something, and the UI needs to update itself to show to the user, yes, I received your input. And so that's where the loop comes in. This work is about 2 things. One is to show that if an attacker can implement 4 attack primitives, which is basically the active and passive version of an attacker trying to compromise the input and the output channel, then you can do a lot of bad stuff. And the second point is that these attacks are actually possible. We identified a number of design vulnerabilities that allow us to mount a bunch of new attacks we call Cloak and Dagger. And these are the attacks I'm going to present today. So, first of all, why should we care about UI security? And I come from an academic background, so some of you may say, come on, what is this stuff? Hear me out here. Android features a number of low-level security mechanisms, sandboxing, and even Nick Kravlich today, that I'm pleased to see here, gave a fantastic talk on reducing the attack surface. And this is amazing stuff. And, is actually making a difference. And I've seen around these researchers, they are having actually a much more difficult life trying to exploit these low-level vulnerabilities. However, some of these UI bugs can actually bypass these vulnerability, these design security mechanisms. And, if you can click like a user, then you can do something we would call confuse deputy, which means, instead of hacking the settings up, what you can do is to click like a user and ask the settings up, can I please get all the permissions? Okay? So that's why I believe these UI attacks are actually important. Of course, they're not as powerful as, root exploits and things like this. But, as a researcher, I believe that this is also a direction and an area where we should focus our attention. Now, the title of the talk starts with 2 permissions, and I'm going to explain you which these 2 permissions are. In Android, permissions work in this way. In the latest version of Android, what happens is that an app can require, for example, the location permission. And at runtime, the application can ask the user, can I please get it? And the user needs to say, yes, you can, or no, you cannot. Okay? So the 2 permissions we use, the first one is what we call system alert window. Informally, we call it draw on top. With this, you can draw arbitrary overlays on top of your screen, and it can be completely custom in shape, content, transparency, and they can be either clickable or pass-through. And that's an exclusive OR, and I'm gonna go back to this in a second. And this permission is actually used quite often, 10% of the top 5,000 apps we crawled, and some of these applications are quite popular with billions of users, like Facebook, Skype, and so forth. The second permission is the accessibility service. In theory, it's a mechanism through which an application can assist users with disabilities. And it is very, very powerful. It is notified for each UI event, and it can also inject UI events, such as clicks and so forth. There are some security mechanisms to prevent abuse, but it's very, very powerful. And it's also used by a number of applications, not that common, but is actually used. For example, LastPass is using this permission to automatically fill your password in your forms. Okay? What we show is that these two permissions are enough to do a number of bad things. Now, the question you might have in your mind is, why would a sane user ever grant these two permissions, right? If a user needs to manually enabling this, is not that stealthy attack, is not practical. Well, it turns out that's not the case. What we found is that the drawn to permission is actually automatically granted for applications coming from the Play Store. The reason is that before Android, I don't remember which version, but the drawn to permission was considered as a normal permission, but then Google understood that it's actually quite powerful, and so it classified it as a dangerous one. Unfortunately, there are so many apps and so many users rely on this permission that our understanding is that Google didn't want to explicitly have pop-ups bugging users. And so as of now, if an app asks for this permission and it's installed from the Play Store, it's going to get it automatically. And the second point is that we have developed a number of clickjacking tricks so that the user can actually be lured to enable accessibility service. What's even worse is that the list of permissions is not even shown to the user at any point in time. In the latest version of Android, as I said, there is no list of permissions required. Everything happens at runtime. The drawn top is automatically granted. We get the other permission through clickjacking, so the user doesn't actually see this. What's even worse is that in some version of Android, it's quite tricky to understand if an application requires these permissions or not. For example, this is a view from Android 6, I think, from my proof of concept, which requires both permissions we use in this work. As you can see here, there is a no permissions. If you click, you actually see no permissions. And even if you scroll down here, there is no special access, drawn top, there is absolutely nothing. The way you can see if an app gets a drawn top permission is actually to go to Settings, Apps, click on the gear symbol, and then there is a thing special, something, and then click on drawn top, and then you can see the list of applications. Now, I said that these two permissions are powerful, but there are a number of security mechanisms there to prevent abuse. And now I'm going to give you an overview about these security mechanisms. The first one is that for each click, two things can happen. An overlay can either get the click and know where the user clicked, or the click goes through and the attacker doesn't know where the user actually clicked. So you cannot implement out of the box things like capture and propagate clicks. Why that's the case? Well, imagine this. If you could do this, what you could do is to draw overlays on top of the keyboard, and then what you would do is to wait that the user clicks somewhere. So for example, if the user clicks on this W overlay, the user would hijack the click, understand, okay, the user clicked on W, propagate the click, and so the attacker knows that the user clicked on the W. And so you could create a number of overlays and you can understand exactly where the user clicked. Of course, you cannot do this. Another trick, if you're familiar with the Windows Manager, there is a flag called flag watch outside touch, for which an overlay can receive notification about clicks that reach outside other applications. Okay? As a security mechanism, in this case, the coordinates of the click are set to 0. So an application can understand the user clicked somewhere, but it doesn't know where the user clicked. Okay? Second mechanism is about making sure that it's quite difficult to enable accessibility service. And so it's a multi-step approach. You need to first browse to this window where you need to select your application, and then you need to click on the switch, and then you need to click on, yes, I actually want this. So this makes sure that the user is very aware about what it's doing. Third security mechanism is a prevention about clickjacking. Now, clickjacking has been known, even mobile, for quite a few years, and I'm going to give you a very quick introduction about how this attack works. This is not novel stuff. This has been presented somewhere else. let's say that you want to lure the user to click on the OK button. What you do is to create an overlay on top of everything, and then you create an overlay that seems like a button for which the clicks actually go through. And so where the user clicks here, the click actually reaches the bottom. Okay? So what Google did to prevent this attack, actually there are a number of talks about this topic. The latest one and the most comprehensive I found is from Black Hat Asia from 2014. And what Google did, as I said, is to implement a protection mechanism which we call obscure flag. The way it works is the following. Basically, when you have a widget and it's going to receive a click, there is a flag that is going to be set if and only if the click actually went through another overlay. So the OK button can understand, hey, there was something on top of me, I'm not going to trust this click. Another way of implementing this is to call this method, set filter touches when obscure, which basically means to test the framework. Please, if there was something on top while I go click, don't even deliver the click to me. I don't want to know about this. Okay? So the way it's implemented in the accessibility service is the following. Let's say we have this view. Let's say we cover it with an overlay. If the user clicks here, it's going to get a pop-up like this, where it says, because an app is obscuring me, I'm not going to trust you. Please disable whatever overlay you have, but there is no way I'm going to trust this click. Why? Again, for preventing clickjacking. The last security mechanism that is in place is that accessibility service cannot read sensitive information, for example, passwords. And if you check from the documentation, what was written is that basically since privacy can be compromised by leaking sensitive information, the password is not exposed to accessibility services. And in fact, if you take a password widget and you do a getText method, you're going to get an empty string. You're not going to get anything. Okay? Good. Now I'm ready to show you what we found. I'm going to start with an attack we call context-aware clickjacking. And clickjacking can be tricky when you need to have multi-stage settings. The question is, where did the user click? Should I move to the next stage or not? And things like this. So what if the user clicks somewhere else? Do I need to reset myself? So there are a number of uncertainties that might arise. And again, there are a number of security mechanisms to prevent an application to understand where the user clicked if the click doesn't reach the malware, right? And so the key point here is, what if there is only one way for a click to not reach the malicious application? Think about this. We want the user to click this button. What we could do is to cover everything but the button with some overlays for which the clicks do not go through. Okay? And the remaining part, you actually cover it with an overlay for which clicks actually go through. Now, if you click here, you're going to get some coordinates. Same if you click here. But if you click here, you're going to get 0, 0 for the security defense I mentioned before. And so the attacker knows exactly that the user clicked exactly where he wanted, and we can go to the next step. So you can adapt and go to the next step. The second part of this attack to do clickjacking is that we need to bypass this obscure flag. And the obscure flag is helpful to understand if there was something on top and if there was some other overlay covering the button. However, who says that to do clickjacking we need to cover the target button? Think about this again. We want the user to click on this OK button. What if we cover everything but the OK button? It's an OK button. It's extremely generic. And it's extremely simple nowadays to lure a user to click on this. Quite simple. This is just an example, but it's just an OK button. And the thing is that these buttons protected by this obscure flag are usually very generic. And so as long as you can hide the context, the attacker wins. So more in general, we call this context hiding attack. And the big issue is that applications do not have enough context information to take informed decision. And the obscure flag to us seems conceptually broken. It's not enough to protect only the button. You need to protect the entire UI. Unfortunately, it's not that easy to fix, because if too much context is exposed, a malicious application can actually use it to mount different kind of attack, like phishing and things like this. And if you have the entire context and know exactly what's thrown on top, you can now do state inference attacks and things like this. So not easy. Now, the problem is that with these two tricks, it's actually becoming very, very easy to do clickjacking to enable a CBD service. And again, we just need to eject 3 clicks. These clicks do not need to be consecutive. There is no guessing involved, no timing tricks. We don't need to guess, did the user click here or not? No. The user can click wherever he wants, and if he clicks there, then we go to the next step. Otherwise, we keep the same UI. Now, Before we go into, okay, what we can do with this accessibility service, I want to have quite a discussion about this obscure flag, because not only we found it's not useful, but we found a couple of things that were quite interesting. The first one is that the documentation is slightly misleading. If you check the docs, there is written that this flag indicates whether there was an overlay that fully or partially cover an overlay. So it seems this is not true, in the sense that if you cover it partially and then you click in a place that was not covered, actually this flag doesn't seem to be set. And it seems that Google is quite aware of this. We checked the source code and we found a different flag, which is hidden from the documentation, called flag window is partially obscured. The interesting part is that the documentation here, this part is exactly the same as the flag window is obscure. The difference is this, where we say, unlike flag window obscure, this is actually true. And this is not exposed to documentations, and I tried and I never seen this flag actually set, so I guess it's gonna come in a newer version of Android. The other point is actually a little bit worse. We found out there are ways to abuse this obscure flag in a way to mount even worse attacks. And so the trick is that with a new attack, we call it invisible grid attack, where we can record all the keystrokes by only requiring these draw on top permissions. And we basically use the abuse the obscure flag security mechanism. The attack works in this way. This represents a phone that is laid down. So now the attacker can create overlays like this. Okay? These overlays are drawn invisible, so the user doesn't see them. The clicks are passed through, so the user even interacts with the phone and doesn't see that there is something on top because everything works as expected. And we create them with this flag watch outside touch, which means that wherever the user clicks, each of these overlays is going to receive a different motion event. Of course, the coordinates are not set because of the security mechanism I mentioned before, but they are going to receive a motion event. And the goal of the attacker is to understand where did the user click. Well, we found out that the way the obscure flag is implemented actually allows the attacker to understand exactly where the user clicked. The way it works is the following. Basically, for each click, let's say the user clicks on number 1, the highest target point is computed, and then each overlay is comparing its Z level, let's say, with the target point. So in this case, overlay 1 is saying, well, that's me, that's okay, and everybody else is going to see the same. The target point is actually lower than me, everything is cool. However, if you click on number 2, the target point is higher than 1. So 1 is going to set obscure, while all the other 3 are going to be not obscured. And I guess now you're understanding the trick, right? If I click on 3, you're going to get this pattern. If you click on 4, you're going to get this pattern. So from the patterns of the obscure flag that each of these motion events receive, you can actually understand where the user clicked by using the obscure flag as a side channel. Now, the way you weaponize this is that instead of creating just random 4 overlays, you actually create a number of them, 1 for each key. And now the attacker knows exactly where the user is clicking, passwords, and things like this. This, again, only requires the draw on top permission. There is no CBD service involved. And the big problem here is that, in our opinion, this window manager is crazily complicated, and UI security seems to be like as an afterthought. I don't mean that Google doesn't care. What I mean is that it seems that it's less understood that more common bugs like buffer flow and things like this, and it seems more systematic work needs to be done to understand what's going on and how can we protect from these side channels, for example, that may appear. The other thing we think is that it seems that there is a violation of the principle of least privilege, where basically overlays are, application can create overlays that are completely invisible, pass through, and they are completely customizable, and these allow the attacker to actually play weird tricks with the UI. And, you know, it might not be necessary that you could do this. Now back to the accessibility service. Once we get it, what can we do? So another design issue we found is that by default, these UI objects are all treated non-security sensitive. So in a way, we are treating security as the exception and not as the rule. And we know security is quite bad when you do this. For example, I mentioned before that a CBD service should not be able to get your passwords. But what we found is that the keys building up the keyboard itself are treated as normal buttons. And so whenever you click on a button, basically the malware is going to receive an accessibility event with exactly which button you clicked. And so now you can get all the passwords. Similar example, two-factor authentication codes. All these guys are not protected. So a malware with a CBD service can actually read them off the screen. One of the most powerful, actually, that we found is the security pad. This is the view through which you unlock your phone. What we found is that these buttons are treated as normal buttons. So what happens is that in the background, an application is going to receive notification when you click on the pin, which means you can steal the pin. And what you can also do, you can inject the pin and unlock the phone. And the crazy part for us is that apparently you can do this while keeping the screen completely off. So we have this attack scenario where once you're compromised, you leave your phone there, you can stare at it, and you have no idea what's going on. Now, there are more interesting attacks if you can mix these two permissions together. And for example, this is how traditional phishing works in the mobile world. So what happens is that the attacker needs to understand the user went on Facebook and he draws something on top that looks like Facebook. And now the user types the password in, clicks login. And the problem is that at the end of the day, the user is actually still logged out. And so you might be suspicious, did something bad happen. If you mix these two permissions, what you can do is the following. You understand traceability service, the user went on Facebook, you create something on top, then the user starts typing things, you press login, and then with a traceability service, we steal the password, we put the password in a real Facebook app, we click login, and at the end of the day, the user is actually completely logged in, exactly as he was expecting. And basically, this is doing complete UI in the middle, and there is no way to detect this, even if you know you're under attack. Another attack is where basically we show a video to the user, and then in the meantime we actually click around and we can do bad stuff. One example is basically we can install a secondary application from wherever, and then we can enable all the permissions, and then we can do cleanup steps so that the user doesn't see any weird artifacts after the attack was run. Other attacks, you can do some ransomware where instead of encrypting all the files, what you can do is to change the pin to something that is attacker controlled, and then basically the user is locked out from his phone. Another way is that you can cover the Chrome application, and then you can basically take over a Google account by stealing passwords and so forth. You can still save passwords and things like this. And the other problem is that even if Google fixes its own applications, there are a number of apps there that will remain vulnerable unless they start to try to defend themselves. And I have a couple of videos now. Let's see if this is going to fly. This is going to be clickjacking to get a CBD service, and then we're going to install the secondary app. Let's see. All right. All right, so we're going to open the proof of concept. So what we did is to simulate the user needs to use some kind of tutorial, and so we're going to say, okay, please start tutorial. And then we're going to say, we're going to show you something, and it's going to tutorial about being a nice guy. Humans are going to be represented with droids. Press next. And then we're going to tell the user, we're going to show you a video, and please press OK when you're ready. And the user press OK. At this point, we start showing a video. And what happened is that the CBD service is actually already enabled. And while the video is playing, we are actually clicking around automatically and installing a secondary application, enable all the permissions, and things like this. And that's it. If you do recents, there is nothing there to see. Now I'm going to show you what actually happened behind the scene. We open the same application. And basically, the first click on the start tutorial actually went on the first click you need to go to the CBD service. And then the next is actually clicking on the switch. And the OK button you see now is actually the OK button from the real CBD service. And since the OK button is not covered, obscure flag is not triggered, and then you can pull the attack off. Now what's happening is that we are installing secondary application. We are, I think, now enabling device admin. Now we are enabling all the permissions. And now we are going to recents and swipe everything off so that the user has absolutely no clue about what happened. And that's it. Another thing is ransomware. And I don't know if Simon is here, but he did this. Thanks a lot. And the video is actually quite fast. What's happening is that we already took the pin with the tag I showed before, and then we are basically changing the pin. And this can happen very, very fast. Ready? Okay. Start this. Boom. Change the pin. Reset the pin. and putting a message that the user knows is infected, powering off, and the user is out of his phone. All right. So I hope I convinced you these attacks are quite powerful. One other question is, are these actually practical? Now, the question for these UI attacks, you need to ask this question because it's not like, root exploit and then you need to run a script and then you get a shell or something like this, but there is user interaction and, in the past, other people actually have shown that this is, okay? From clickjacking, you can get a CBD service. This was, I think, March 2016, so a while ago. And Google said, we are not going to fix this because we believe the attack is not practical. So we actually, in our paper, made a big deal out of this with trying to show, we tried to get the smoking gun that these attacks should be considered seriously because they actually work. And that's what we did. From my background, I come from an academic background, when we need to have a smoking gun about practicality of attacks, we do user studies. So I recruited 20 guys at Georgia Tech, and when I did these experiments, and we tried to attack these users with the 3 most complicated attacks we had from the technical standpoints. And the results are pretty bad. Nobody could guess the clickjacking. Same for the silent go mode app installation. Nobody understood what happened. And it's not that we just ran the attack. We ran the attack, and then we gave the phone to the user. So the user was actually able to freely go around the phone, try to understand if there was something weird or not. And again, nobody was able to tell us, hey, something actually happened. The third attack was a stealthy phishing. Actually, 18 out of 20 fell for it. 2 of them managed to trigger a bug in my prototype implementation. Basically, we had some Facebook phishing thing, and I told them to click login, and these guys click on the OK button from the keyboard. My prototype was broken, and so they noticed something fishy in the UI, but they did not understand they were under attack. What we also did was to fix our prototype, and then we told them, OK, we're going to run the experiment twice. One time with Vacuum, the other time we did not. And even if they knew we were attacking them, they could not tell me when they were actually attacked. So we believe this stuff is actually quite practical. And we took this occasion to actually ask them, by the way, do you know about these permissions? And it seems that none of them knew about both. And the point is, if a user doesn't know about this permission, why the hell should go around in special settings and special views and so forth to see if an application has these permissions? There is no incentive for the user to actually try to figure this out. Now, how can we fix this? The first thing we did was to report the simple bugs we have through AOSP issues. This was August 2016. And the first one we reported was the invisible grid attack, and it was recognized as an actual bug. Unfortunately, it is not fixed yet. We reported also the CBD service that we can do a number of bad things. For example, stealing passwords, while documentation says we cannot do this. And it was quite tricky to have a discussion with them. So we reported a bug, and the first answer we got after a month was won't fix, work as intended. So guys, documentation says I cannot get the passwords, and I have a proof of concept I shared from which I can get the password. What should we do? A month later, great, high severity, champagne was opened, and we're super happy. However, 1 month after, we actually got another message with won't fix, work as intended, because if you fix this, if we limit these services, the device will be unusable. And it's kind of a mix-up here where basically it's like we don't know how to fix it, and maybe we should fix it. So it's kind of confusing thing. If it's a bug, it should be fixed, or maybe we don't know how to fix it, and so as a community we should figure something out. But we don't believe that's a good reason. But we still thought, as guys, there is written in your documentation that you should not be able to get your password. And the reply was awesome, we will update the documentation. The amazing part is that they actually did. So what I checked is that at June 6th, security note was still there. I got the link from the Internet Time Machine. And the current version, the security note actually disappeared. So at least, documentation is consistent with what we found. And I can brag forever with my friends, like I have all day in the documentation, and still no CV, unfortunately. Probably they're not covered by this. All right, kidding apart. What we did next is to think on how to convince Google that clickjacking is actually quite powerful, and that we should probably do something. And again, it was tricky. I checked the qualifying vulnerabilities, and there is a message like this. Some classes of vulnerabilities generally do not qualify. And guess what? Tab jacking, which is another version of click jacking, and URI addressing generally are not covered by the bug bounties, which make me very, very sad. And after this, I went to this mode and this mode and this mode for a few months. And the point being, I don't care about money, but it's weird that some bugs like this were, sure, they're not like root exploits that should be fixed immediately, but they're actually quite powerful, and maybe we should treat them more seriously. And so, yeah, said. What we actually did eventually is that we had an opportunity to share the paper with Adrian Ludwig, who is, I think, the head of Android security. And we did not have contact directly with him, but we know that he read the paper, his team read the paper, and they are considering this very seriously. Unfortunately, all the attacks I presented today are still not fixed. Latest version of Android, even with July's updates, I have POC on my personal phone that is a Nexus 5X that is fully updated, which is disappointing. And in our mind, we said, okay, we believe these are actually a big deal. How are they reacting? So either two ways. One is something like this, where it's like whatever UI bugs, which is my best bet, at least in the past. The other one was something like this. I think it's quite unlikely. Thing as always, truth is like somewhere in the middle. And I actually was more on the option on the left because I worked on UI security with one of my PhD colleagues at UC Santa Barbara, and we tried to report these UI bugs, and it seems that the response is not that, oh, this is amazing, we should fix it, absolutely. No, we reported, I think, a bug 3 years ago where we could cover the screen, navigation, status bar, things like this. I think it's still unfixed after 3 years. And apparently I'm not alone. So I was browsing through internet and checking some talks, and I found a talk from Nick where basically it was an Android security symposium, and where he was presenting again this attack surface reduction and things like this. And the first question he got in the QA was, this is great stuff, but there are also plain boring bugs like in the UI, and I'm stopped reporting them because it seems that you guys don't care. And I don't know if I'm gonna ever meet this guy. I don't know if the guy is here is gonna ever see this presentation. I want you to know that I feel you, bro. I understand what you have been through. Now, kidding apart, again, this is another example why, at least on our side, we have this feeling where these UI bugs are not considered seriously. Again, I'm not trying to say these are as bad as other low-level bugs. They are not. They are less practical and things like this, but I think we should do something. And, on our side, with an academic paper, we published this paper as IEEE Security and Privacy. We had a proposal on, quite academic proposal, how we should fix the Android UI. And we have a number of things. I'm not going to go through them today, but everything is in the paper. And, given the reaction, we said, maybe we're not ready yet to understand, okay, we need a defense. Now, we really need to push for, okay, maybe we should fix these things. And this was published in May. What happened next was quite interesting. Basically, we presented this paper. We even got an award for Distinguished Practical Paper Award. And we set up a website. We did about it. And then it went insane. I think thread posts started to cover this. And after that, it exploded. It was all over the news. And the reaction was fantastic. Some people say this is amazing. Some other people, this is absolute overhyped BS. If you are into popcorns, there is a thread on Twitter that you should really check it out. It's amazing. And we even got nominated for the most overhyped bug yesterday. We did not win, but I had my speech ready to try to put some more hype for this talk. That was my jogging version of getting this. And so it seems there was a lot of interest, and of course, some people got pissed because of too much publicity for this. And of course, I'm a big fan of this work. I like it. On the overhype part, I actually hear you guys. It was crazy amount of press coverage. And for us, what was interesting is that some of these news articles actually asked Google to provide an answer, to provide a comment. And so the comment from Google was, we have two ways of dealing with this. The first one is that we deploy some protection mechanism in Play Protect and Play Store to detect these apps. And as of now, even before these reports came out, this was May, we have security mechanisms to make sure the Android or these are not possible. And so we took these paths and we tried to investigate okay, are we really, what can we do about this? Do we agree that everything's going to be fine or not? So we started with the first one, and we start to ask ourselves, if I would be Google, how can I detect these attacks? Now, from the behavior point of view, I think it's quite tricky because you can implement these tricks in many, many different ways. So personally, what I would do is to scan applications on the store with these two permissions. There are not that many applications, I believe, with requiring both permissions. So that's already red flag, and somebody should check them out. And so this led to the question of, do we actually need both permissions to do these attacks? Well. So what we found was interesting. The first part is that found a way to bootstrap these attacks only with this system alert window. And the point is that, okay, once we have this application, the goal is to install a secondary application from the store where a CBD service is required. And so you get the first one, you install the second one, and then the first one can enable the CBD service for the second one, and after this, these apps can actually play together and do the malicious activity by collaborating. So good luck with this. The question is, how do we do this, right? So clickjacking again. What we found is that many apps are actually vulnerable to clickjacking, including Play Store app. So basically, what you can do is that programmatically you can open the Play Store to a specific application. Before, of course, you cover it with an overlay. You lure the user to click here, and then after a while, the application is already installed. It can be after 2 days, whatever. And then again, you can open this view programmatically with an intent, and then you lure the user to click here. After this point, the secondary application is installed. And again, you can do all the attacks I showed you before, enabling the one from the second application. Now let's go one step further. Do we actually need the system alert window? So while I was thinking about this, we had this, of course, challenge accepted. We had this realization that system alert window is used to create windows of this type alert system. Okay? And the point is that we don't need to create windows with this type. So each type in Android defines in which range of Z level your overlay is going to be created. And this kind of alert system is quite powerful because you can go on top of the status bar and things like this. But for these attacks, we're not going to do ransomware or things like this. We just need to go over all activities, and that's it. And talking to one of my friends, we realized, wow, toasts are actually the way to go. So toasts are one of the features where you can create them with this make text API. When you create them, they look like this. They're just very brief notification. It turns out that so there is this API, and you can create them for a limited duration, either 2 seconds or 3.5 seconds. Now, toasts have been abused in the past, and the usual trick is that you keep creating them. Okay? And what we found is that it's actually possible to create custom toasts by using exactly the same API that you would use to create these system overlays. So you have this window manager, add view, and things like this. And it's actually pretty simple to port the current proof of concept to use toast. And when I say pretty simple, I actually mean it. You literally substitute the string with type toast, and the attack works out of the box. Now, this works actually in Android 6. And so you can bootstrap these attacks with 0 permissions. And the practicality issue is that you need to eject 2 more clicks to get the CBD service. But for the invisible grid attack, you don't need a CBD service. So out of the box, an application with 0 permission can read exactly where you're clicking. This actually was fixed in Android 7. So Google, toast had been abused in the past in different ways. Google was aware of this. And so you cannot pull this trick off because there are a number of protection mechanisms against toast abuse. And so in this case, for the latest version, you can bootstrap these attacks with 1 permission. Now we also looked at Android O. There was a couple of plot twists here. So we looked at Preview 3, developer version. Basically, invisible grid attack is fixed. And apparently Google fixed it, and the way we propose in the paper, that means no propagation of obscure flags for motion on side events. So fantastic job. For clickjacking, we were quite surprised because we saw that it's actually more vulnerable than before. The OK button is actually not protected by the obscure flag. And the third point, to use their own words, works as intended. These are not going to be fixed, so I'm not surprised they're still there. But the very, very good news is that 3 days ago, Google released the Preview 4 for Android O, and it turns out the clickjacking to enable a CBD service is fixed. And again, we are super happy because it seems they use what we suggest in the paper, that is at least for the settings app, which is super important, just don't draw overlays. And there are no backward compatibility issues. What you can do is that you make the application believe that the overlays are drawn, but you just don't draw them. So if something is fishy, the user is going to notice. So in Android O, Preview 4, what happens is that if you go to a CBD service, overlays are disappearing, and so you cannot do clickjacking anymore. And that's the same thing they did for permission list. And so now in Android 7, if you go to permission, all overlays are automatically disabled. And this makes all the tags more difficult, so that's a super promising direction, and I hope these fixes are gonna also be present in the final Android O version. Now, I gave this talk a couple of times around, and I started to talk with some companies, and it seems that fixing clickjacking might be actually much trickier than at least what I was expecting when I started working on this. For a settings app, what you can do is to disable everything. But if this obscure flag should be used in other contexts, Play Store app, or Facebook credentials, Twitter, all these things, then you can have practicality issues. Why? Because it seems that there are applications like this one, whose main functionality is to create an overlay on top of everything that is transparent. You still see it, but it's transparent, and for which clicks go through. Okay? And if you use the obscure flag around, this creates potential problems. And for example, when you install this application, they're going to warn you, pay attention, there are some issues with Android 6, and you need to disable this application when enable permission. And they say something like this: there is an Android 6 only bug that prevents granting permissions. This bug is actually the implementation of the obscure flag, so it's actually the security mechanism. And they say it's fixed in Android 7 because in Android 7, when you go to permissions, they are actually, the overlays are disabled automatically. But of course, if this obscure flag is used in other applications, then a third-party app cannot just decide, let's disable all the overlays. The settings app can do because it's a system app from Google. And so, I believe this is still an open problem. Another thing that I've been told is that there are some manufacturers that basically have these keyboards that are implemented with overlays, where basically you see the keyboard and then you see there is an invisible overlay there. And so apparently some of these companies try to use the obscure flag in production, and then they need to disable it because it was creating too much problem. People could not type anything anymore because, again, there was this invisible overlay on top, obscure flag freaks out, and said, no, I'm not going to trust anything. All right, so I think this is still an open problem. Now, I have a couple of slides that are not really related to UI attacks. It's more generic, and it's related to Android security in general. And because I thought, okay, we're going to have this eventually fixed, but when our phones are going to get this fixed? So I gave my old Nexus 5 to my dad, and I said, okay, maybe sooner or later it's going to get fixed. But I found this table from Google that says, for Nexus 5, latest date for a security update is going to be October 2016. And so Nexus 5 is actually stuck with Android 6. There are no updates there. And so all these bugs are, I don't know, I think if Google doesn't change anything, they're going to remain there for a while. 5X, same thing. Basically, thinking in a year, my current Nexus 5X is not going to receive updates. And, what should I do? Should I change phone? And the situation doesn't get much better with newer phones, where basically, they're getting quite expensive, but in a couple of years, they're going to be, out of range for getting security updates. And I don't know. I think the direction of attack surface reduction is fantastic. It is a fantastic job from Nick and his team. And one other thing would be to move forward to this modularization of this application that Nick talked about, and maybe so that all phones don't get stuck to previous version of Android, and they can get the actual updates. All right, that's more or less it. Let me wrap up. Presented a bunch of UI attacks. Again, new tricks. Some of these tricks are old, and we found out that the defense mechanisms to prevent these old tricks are actually not very useful, and they actually open the doors to much more powerful attacks. And many low-level security mechanisms can be bypassed. And so that's why we think UI security bugs matter. And honestly, I believe these are low-hanging fruits for the attackers, because it was actually quite simple to implement these attacks. And if I could do this in, a couple of weeks, I'm pretty sure that the guys experienced with crazy low-level buffer overflows and seccomp bypass and stuff like this can pull this out in an afternoon or so. We set up a website with more information. There is a paper, a bunch of demos and things like this. This is my contact information. Of course, I'm very, very happy to talk about this stuff if you want to ping me. And that's more or less it. Thank you very much, guys.